My name is Muriel Stallworth, and on behalf of the organizers of tonight's event, welcome to the second of 4 events in our 11th annual Woodstock Film and Discussion Series. These series highlight environmental and social issues of today and aim to inspire action that each of us can take to help solve those issues. Tonight's event is focusing on bringing back biodiversity and wildlife habitat. And this evening will unfold in 3 parts. First, we will watch a pre-recorded presentation by Doug Tallamy, New York Times bestselling author, professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, and a co-founder of Homegrown National Park. Doug Tallamy is a national leader in the movement to reverse the rapid loss we're seeing in biodiversity and to restore wildlife habitat in the US. Tallamy's 25-minute presentation titled "What's the Rush?" will be followed by a short presentation by Georgia Asher on the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway. Georgia is a founder of the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway and co-organizer of this evening's event. The Woodstock Pollinator Pathway is a local organization which encourages homeowners in the Woodstock area to adopt landscaping practices that help restore pollinator habitat, following Tallamy's quote-unquote new approach to conservation that starts in your yard, end of quote. We will then welcome Lena Fostel, a representative of the Natural Resources Defense Council, who will explain the devastating impact of neonicotinoid pesticides on populations of bees and other pollinators. Lena will talk about the Birds and Bees Protection Act, a bill before the New York State Legislature to restrict the use of neonics in New York State, and she will provide us with useful resources to help get this bill passed. So throughout this session, please feel free to put all of your questions into the chat. And if you can, stay with us at the end of the program for the Q&A. So many thanks to the 3 sponsors of this film series. The Woodstock Land Conservancy, which is a nonprofit organization committed to the protection and preservation of the open lands, forests, water resources, scenic areas, and historic sites in Woodstock and the surrounding area. The Woodstock Transition, which is part of the global transition town movement of communities working to reimagine and rebuild our world in response to the challenges of our time. Woodstock Transition has 7 active working groups who engage locally to strengthen our community's resilience and create positive alternatives. Then the Woodstock Jewish Congregation, which is dedicated to the advancement of Jewish ethics, culture, religion, and sustainability practices. The Woodstock Jewish Congregation strives to enable participants to enrich their lives and that of their communities through worship, celebration, study, and fellowship. We hope you will enjoy this evening's session, and if you feel so inclined, please know that the film series is accepting donations. And now to the beginning of our program, What's the Rush by Doug Tallamy.
We're going to talk about what the rush is. But first, I'm going to start with a story. This is a being I saw in my yard last summer. Looks like a fecal sac that a bird dropped out of its nest. If you take a closer look, you say, well, gee, maybe that's a spider. Look at it at night. Indeed, it is a spider. It's a bola spider. And this is how bola spiders hunt. They drop a single strand of silk. Somebody's got a mute out there, I think. And they put a little sticky glob of glue at the end. And it looks like they're going to go fishing with it. Well, I didn't think this spider would be able to catch anything, but a few minutes later it did. A moth flew in and it got caught on its sticky glob of glue, wraps it up in silk, has a nice meal. And if it does that enough time, it has the energy to create an egg mass. And that's exactly what this spider did. As a matter of fact, she made 3 egg masses. So how does she catch a moth like this? Well, she's actually releasing the sex pheromone of particular species of moth. I wanted to know what the species was, so I unwrapped the things that she was catching, and it turned out it's the bronze cutworm. She caught 10 bronze cutworms in a row in my yard, and I've got bronze cutworms and the caterpillars that create a bronze cutworm because I've got goldenrod. That's their favorite host plant. And the tree I was looking at was an oak tree. which produced this beautiful moth, the dot-line white. And I've got dot-line whites produced by this tree in my yard because I didn't rake the leaves away, because there's a dot-line white cocoon in this little leaf mass right here. And there it is. I'm sure you saw it right away. Here it is up close. If you rake them away, you've just thrown away that beautiful moth. I've got evening primrose moths in my yard because I've got evening primrose. And the moth comes and spends the day with its head stuffed in the flower. It's very cute. I've got zebra swallowtails because I've got pawpaws that I planted there for that exact reason, to attract that beautiful moth. It would take me a week or more to describe all of the species that are now calling our property home because of the plants that we have put back there. It would not take me a week, it wouldn't take me very long at all to describe all the species that are living in a landscape like this, a typical suburban landscape. There is no goldenrod, so there are no bronze cutworms, so there are no bola spiders. There are no oaks, so there are no dot-line whites or hundreds of other species. There are no pawpaws, so there's, oh, give me a break. I don't know why I do that. There we go. So there are no zebra swallowtails. Sorry about that. There are no enotheras, no evening primroses. So we have no evening primrose moths. There is very little life that can live in a typical landscape like this. And of course, you know that. But that is why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines. The insect apocalypse is here, talking about global insect decline. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. A third of our North American bird population is already gone. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is gone. 1 million species face extinction in the next 20 years. 40% of Earth's plants face extinction. These are big problems, folks. These are big problems. And they're problems because we have not shared the planet with the natural world. We're taking the resources for ourselves. And that's why Elizabeth Colbert gets to write The Sixth Great Extinction. I'll bet she would have been happier if she didn't have to write that book. Jason Hinkle says, biodiversity loss is such a strange euphemism for the mass destruction of non-human beings. It's the genocide of nature is really what we're talking about. So what's our reaction to these sobering statistics? People are actually studying that. Richard Hobbs wrote a paper about it. He likens our reactions to the 5 stages of grief that we experience when we get typically a news of a terminal illness. First, there's denial. We certainly have plenty of people denying that we have a problem at all. Then there's anger. I feel a little bit of that sometimes. Bargaining, depression, I feel a little bit of that sometimes too. And then the final stage of grief is acceptance. And this is where I take issue. Acceptance is too easily equated with giving up. And giving up's not an option, folks, because nature is not optional. We absolutely need it. So we need a 6th step here, and that is action. That's what Homegrown National Parks all about, taking action. And we do have existing national parks, and they were created primarily because they had exquisite scenery. They were beautiful places. Teddy Roosevelt said, we've got to preserve these places because that's good administration. Natural beauty is a national asset, and recreation produces good citizenship. So our parks were created largely because they were pretty places in which we could play. And that's why we only have about 12% of the US that's formally protected. These dark green areas are where we have our major parks because there's not all that many places that are exquisitely beautiful where we can play. What's happening outside the parks, though, has been appalling. Every 30 seconds, a football field worth of America's natural resources disappears to development. Development, I think it's the most oxymoronic word we have, certainly in the field of ecology. We've got over 40 million acres of lawn. That's an area the size of New England dedicated to an ecological deadscape. And an even deader scape is what we've paved over. We've paved over an area larger than Ohio. There are 2 million acres of golf courses. That's an area larger than Rhode Island and Delaware combined. And we could go on talking about many other statistics. Now, Matt Lee Ashley has observed that evaluating the condition of nature is a bit like watching a leaking pipe. If a person focuses on each drop as it falls to the floor, the leak doesn't seem very damaging. But if you leave for a day and you come back, your room is going to be full of water. And that's exactly what has happened. Now, we talk about an extinction crisis. It is indeed an extinction crisis, but I don't think extinction is the right metric that we should use. We have an extinction crisis, But we have to think about the degradation of common species. Species like the picture you're seeing here, this is the American chestnut. Used to be the dominant tree in our eastern deciduous forests from Maine all the way to Georgia. It's not extinct yet, but it's functionally extinct. It is wiped out by the chestnut blight. The rusty patch bumblebee used to be one of the most common bees in North America. Now it's a big deal if anybody sees even one of them. So it's functionally extinct. Beavers, now beavers are making somewhat of a comeback, but they used to be common in every stream system of the entire country. Their elimination drastically changed the hydrology of the entire country, and it wasn't for the better. So we're really talking about defaunation. That's the real problem. It's local and it's everywhere. Enter E.O. Wilson, Harvard emeritus. Everybody knows Edward O. Wilson, spent his life studying lots of things, but he certainly was trying to save biodiversity. And probably his biggest contribution in that regard was this book that he wrote in 2016, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And in this book, he noted that in order to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet. And if we don't do that, it's going to just disappear everywhere. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't tell us a whole lot about how we were going to do that. Now, fortunately, and somewhat to my surprise, people are actually listening to his Half Earth initiative. The UN has created a global initiative. First, the 30 by 30, we're going to save 30% of the planet by 2030, and that's step one going towards 50 by 50. So the UN is doing what the UN does. They get a bunch of people together and they're negotiating how we're going to protect biodiversity. And it's not going any better than all the negotiations about climate change have gone. Can you imagine negotiating whether or not we're going to save life on planet Earth? Well, that's exactly what the UN is doing. And everybody's got this notion in their head that we're actually going to save 50% of the Earth as pristine ecosystems. How could this be possible? Well, it can't be possible. It's not possible. Half of planet Earth is already in some form of agriculture, certainly not pristine. We've got 7.9, soon to be 8 billion people in the other half, along with all of our infrastructure and our detritus. There isn't 50% of planet Earth that is still pristine. So how can we realize EO's dream? Well, actually, I think the answer is obvious. We're going to need a new approach to conservation, and it's not about putting pristine areas aside. It's about restoring the areas that we have destroyed, and we're going to do that by finding ways for humans and nature to coexist. In the past, we've had this idea that they cannot coexist, but what I have been arguing for a long time now is that coexisting with nature is now the only viable option that's left to us. We absolutely have to find ways to do that. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. So we now need to practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And I'm not just talking about conserving what's there, I'm talking about restoring what is already lost. So in other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. So if protected areas are not large enough, we're going to have to practice conservation outside of those protected areas, outside of preserved areas. So we're going to have to practice conservation in areas like this, but also in areas like this. And as Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young once said, if you can't be with the nature you love, love the nature you're with. I might break into song if I think about that too much. Where are we talking about? We're talking about private property. 78% of the US is privately owned. And 85% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So we have to practice conservation on private property. And lawn is the low-hanging fruit. It's really what got me thinking about Homegrown National Park to begin with. We have more than 40 million acres of lawn. That's a 2005 statistic, so we know it's bigger than that now. And you know, it is a leftover from the class system, the aristocracy of Europe. We're the only ones who could afford lawn, and so it's a status symbol, and we love our status symbols, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. So I know we need lawn for high status, and we need lawn to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we replanted half the area that is now in lawn? That's the idea I had way back in 1987. That would give us 20 million acres that we could put towards conservation right at home. We could create Homegrown National Park, which will be huge. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountain. Add up all those parks, it's still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. I started talking about that in my talks for years. And then I finally, when I wrote Nature's Best Hope, I included it as a chapter. But, talk is cheap. That's pretty much all I do. And then I did meet Michelle, and she talked about how this started. She came up to me after a talk and said, you're just talking to the choir. And I said, yes, it's only the choir who invites me. And she said, well, you're not going to succeed unless you get beyond the choir. You have to use social media, you've got to use marketing, and you've got to do all the things that I know. She was correct. I said, I don't do those things. And she said, I do those things. So let's do it. And that's where homegrownnationalpark.org came from. The ideas you see expressed here are all Michelle's. What are we asking in Homegrown National Park? We're saying we need to reduce the area in lawn. That is the low-hanging fruit. We've got to put more natives into our landscapes, and we've got to remove the invasive species that are already there. Our product is national awareness, not just of what the problem is, but what the solutions are. We're going to change the culture. We're going to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not something we should do. It's something we absolutely must do. And it's everybody's responsibility to do it. And the map, once it's fully operational, will allow us to measure our conservation progress. It'll be a powerful scientific tool. Homegrown National Park is going to convert hope to action. We need action. It's aspirational. It doesn't rely on governmental support. Not that we would turn it down if anybody offers it. It's going to merge existing conservation efforts like Audubon and National Wildlife Federation and Wild Ones. We're not, it's no paid membership here. We're not stealing members from anybody. We're uniting them so that we can all have one visual in terms of our progress. And that visual will reveal holes in our biological corridors that we're going to need in order to connect the wild places that remain. So what we're envisioning is something like the COVID maps you see in the New York Times, where each county will be colored in with the progress it's making. This is a simulation, of course, but we're talking about a science-based grassroots call to action that can address the two major problems we have in this on planet Earth. We've got climate change, but we've got a biodiversity crisis, and Homegrown National Park will address both of those simultaneously. So what's the rush? Well, remember these statistics. They're not waiting. They're coming every day. There is great urgency in enacting this Homegrown National Park solution. We've got 48 million residential landscapes in the US. If we add 1,000 properties to Homegrown National Park each month, it sounds like great progress, but it'll take us 4,083 years to reach all of them. So that's not quite fast enough. If we look at that in terms of property size, the average lot size in the US is 0.3 of an acre. So if we add 1,000 acres to Homegrown National Park each month, it'll take us 1,200 years to convert all landscapes. Ooh, somebody's got to mute. So who's going to help Homegrown National Park make this rapid transition? The problem is most people do not garden themselves. They just hire somebody. It's not that they don't like nature or they don't like gardening. They don't have time. They're raising kids or doing other things. So they hire somebody. So what we need to do is create the person that they're going to hire. We need to create a team of skilled ecological landscapers. There are groups doing that now. We need more of them. They need to do it faster. Every place I go to give a talk, people say, who can I hire? And I usually don't know. But once this team is in place, these people are going to have the information that everybody needs. Ecological landscapers are going to know that every landscape has 4 ecological responsibilities. It's got to support food webs so that we have functioning ecosystems. It's got to sequester carbon, get that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It has to manage our watershed, and it has to support pollinators. And they're going to know that lawn accomplishes none of those goals. So our fascination with the lawn is going to end. They're going to know that plant choice matters. There are 3 kinds of plants out there: contributors, non-contributors, and detractors. A contributing plant is one that's helping to enhance local ecosystems. It's going to be a native. Some are much better than others. A non-contributor would be something like ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's not an invasive plant, but it contributes very little to ecosystem function. And a detractor would be an invasive plant like calorie pear, which becomes an ecological tumor. It escapes and pushes out the native plants in our functioning ecosystems. Ecological landscapers are going to know that caterpillars are an essential component to our landscapes. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. And they're going to know that keystone plants are keystone plants because they support the most caterpillars. Just 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs, which makes keystone plants essential components of the ecological houses that we're building. They're the support system. Our house isn't going to stand up without keystone plants. We've been trying to build ecological houses out of wallpaper for the last 100 years, and that doesn't work. They're also going to know that insects are the little things that run the world. E.O. Wilson's famous statement. They're going to know that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat the particular plants for which they have the adaptations to get around their particular defenses. So think monarch butterflies eating toxic milkweeds. Very few other insects can do that. You take away the milkweeds, you take away the monarch butterflies. They're going to know that we need pollinators, but they're also going to know it's not because they're pollinating a third of our crops. You hear that every day on the news. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. But then people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Everybody needs pollinators because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Losing our pollinators is not an option unless we want to lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. They're also going to know that light pollution and mosquito fogging are two of the major causes of insect declines, and they're fairly easily reversed. If we put in yellow bulbs instead of our white bulbs, it's going to decrease insect loss to light pollution, and we can, of course, fire Mosquito Joe pretty easily. They're going to know that tiny properties can be very important in terms of conservation. It can happen on any size property, right from a flower pot on up. And most of all, they're going to know that conservation works. It's going to make it worthwhile. And I'll give you just one example of what's happened at our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like when we moved in. It was part of a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. And had been mowed for hay. Very little life there. As a matter of fact, where it wasn't mowed for hay, it was nothing but invasive plants. That's my wife Cindy there, getting rid of these invasives. It can be done. This is what it looks like today. And once our research showed that the number of moth species you have in your local food web is a great index for how healthy that food web is, how complex and stable it is. I started counting the moth species that have come to our barren landscape since we moved in, and I am up to 1,140 species of moths, that's 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state of Pennsylvania. They are there because we put the plants back. And because so many of them are types of bird food, we now support 60 species of birds that have bred on our property, not flew by, but bred. But is reducing the lawn enough? That was the low-hanging fruit, but if you look at the numbers, there are issues with that. We've got 1.9 billion acres in the lower 48 states. Less than 12%, or 228 million acres, are protected, so not very much. That leaves 1.6 billion acres unprotected. Now, 78% of that, or 1.3 billion acres, is privately owned. If Homegrown National Park restores 20 million of those acres, that's only 1.53% of what really needs to be restored. So our goals are too modest. We have to increase them by doing more than shrinking the lawn. Most of our privately owned land is in small woodlots, cropland, and rangeland, and we want to get owners of all those properties in Homegrown National Park as well. There are 406 million acres of woodlots managed by private citizens, not logging companies, in the US. If they're managed properly, by managing the invasives in those woodlots and by sustainably harvesting those woodlots, they all should be on Homegrown National Park. This is where our croplands are. 410 million acres are now in cropland, big area. But there are things that are farmers can do. We can restore the native plants on the edges of the fields. We can put in prairie strips. We can restore hedgerows that have been removed, and we can stop using neonicotinoid pesticides. All of those things will vastly increase the biodiversity in our farmlands. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland, all of which could be good habitat if it's managed properly. We overgraze an awful lot of it. That, by the way, is 4.5 times the size of Texas. If we restore the riparian corridors that go through those rangelands, research is showing that that restores the biodiversity over the entire area. Very doable. Now, there's something that's common to each one of these conservation approaches. I learned this from one of my students in a class last semester. In a paper she wrote, she said, we claim to be managing species and habitats, but what we're really managing is people. And that's what we're talking about with Homegrown National Park. We're managing the people that own all of this land. It has been degraded because of the way we've treated our land, but we can also restore it. So we're talking about changing the culture. We've mentioned that, but it's so important. Right now, it's an adversarial relationship with nature. We must change it to a collaborative one if this is going to work. So what's the rush? We're rapidly destroying the natural world that supports us. Our parks and preserves are not enough. So we got to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on private property. Global conservation initiatives, they sound good on paper, and the UN's talking about it, but we can't wait for them to actually come up with actionable recommendations. We've been waiting for climate change, and it's just not happening. So the power and responsibility of Earth stewardship really resides in the individual, each one of us. That's a new message to most of the people on the planet. Our challenge is to make this a reality, to make it part of our culture. Can we do it? I think we can. We don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but we can save it where we live. And if we're doing that, we certainly need to join Homegrown National Park. It empowers each one of us. You know, the Earth's problems are huge, and most people feel absolutely powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can do all the things we just talked about. They can shrink the lawn, they can put in a pollinator garden, they get rid of their invasive plants, they can turn out their lights, they can fire Mosquito Joe, they can shrink the lawn, do all the things I forgot to tell you. One person can do that and totally revitalize their local ecosystem. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, you help somebody who does. So Aldo Leopold said a number of wonderful things. And one of them was, there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. Now, I know he was talking about the emotional connection with nature, but actually no one can live very long without wild things, for it's the wild things that keep us alive.
Hi, I'm Georgia Asher, and I hope you feel as inspired by this video as I am. If you want to join Homegrown National Park and you missed the web address at the end of the video, here it is again, and we'll send it out in a few days along with some other resources in an email to everyone who signed up for this event. So in addition to joining Homegrown National Park, slide two, Ellie? Okay. Right here in Woodstock, we have another organization. It's local, so you might want to join it too. It's working to achieve the same things that Doug talked about here in the video. It's called the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway, and I know that some of you have already joined and a lot of you know about it, and I know that some of your neighbors have joined too. In other words, there's a lot of enthusiasm in our community for the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway. And we're not, by the way, just talking about honeybees. We're talking about wild bees, native bees, moths, all kinds of different beneficial insects, okay. What we're trying to do is to support the local food web, to support biodiversity in general, and to support wildlife. The way we do this is we help people to create good habitat in their own yards and reach out to their neighbors to do the same thing so that we get a string of habitats. We want this connectivity because we know that certain native bees and other pollinators can't fly that far without food and places to rest. These strings of habitat we refer to as pathways. When you get these pathways of native plants, you get the beneficial insects, the birds, and the biodiversity. So that's the point. So in addition to the many private households that have joined the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway, we now also have the Ashokan Rail Trail, and we hope soon we'll have some town properties to be included. Also, there are other towns in the area that I and other people from the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway have been talking to help them get their pollinator pathways up and running. We have a great website. It's the Woodstock NY Pollinator Pathway.org, and we're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We need slide 3. Okay. Doug Tallamy was talking about a national and international decline in insects, birds, and biodiversity. So you might think, well, this isn't happening in Woodstock. In Woodstock, we're very environmentally conscious. We have intact forests and so forth. But think again. Look at your porch light of a warm summer evening. Not tonight. That's not a warm summer evening. And what you'd expect to see is a whole lot of moths circling around, unless, of course, you have a yellow light like Doug suggested. But you won't see moths with your normal porch light. And this is so shocking. We're missing all these pollinators who are also extremely important food for birds and other animals. And now we also have, in addition to this casual observation, a scientific study in New York State that backs up this drop in pollinator population. It was recently published. It's a scientific survey of 451 native pollinator species in New York State, and it's called the Empire State Native Pollinator Survey. It shows a 38 to 60% population drop of these insects. Think of that, 38 to 60%. Those are really huge numbers. And if you think of that happening again in the next few decades, it's really horrifying. It's unthinkable. So the Woodstock, let's see, we can end that slide. The Woodstock Pollinator Pathway helps you in many ways to develop pollinator habitat, which is, we're talking about biodiversity in general, not just honeybees, a lot of different things. And it helps animals up the food chain. We have in-person events where you meet other people and at the same time hone your skills in habitat creation. These events are such things as seed exchanges, field trips with experts to identify native plants, ground prep and planting days. We have tours of properties that are beautifully landscaped with native plants. Also, we have virtual presentations by experts. And you can go to our website where we have recordings of those that we've had in the past, and you can watch those now if you miss them. For example, here are some that we've had. Designing gardens from nature, invasive plant species, bees, both wild and domestic, neonicotinoid pesticides, installing a meadow. We also have a link there to a longer video presentation that Doug Tallamy did specifically for the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway. We're so pleased with this presentation. Thank you, Doug. And our website has many other good things. We have plant lists to show, for example, if you want bloom from early spring to late fall, which is good for pollinators. It tells you which plants you can think of planting. You can also sign up for our newsletter. And we have a list of resources such as books, videos, and nurseries that carry native plants. We also have a map of the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway. Slide 4. So very important. From the website, you can join the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway, and you can order for $10 one of these attractive signs, which you can put on your property. It's metal, so it won't fall apart immediately. And to join, you just need to fill out a short form at the website and take a pledge to do at least some of these things. 1, go pesticide and herbicide free. 2, stop mowing some of your lawn and let wildflowers grow. Reduce the lawn. Add native seeds and plants. Leave the leaves in the fall for overwintering insects. Leave some bare ground and dead wood for nesting native bees, and manage the invasives. So slide 5. We have a map that I mentioned to show the pathway of pollinator habitat in our area. When you sign up to join the pollinator pathway, we need your address so that we can put your property on our map to show connected habitat. We don't give away your private information. On the map, you can see there are no names or addresses, only a big lavender dot to show the approximate location of your property. You can find this map on our website under Home. Okay. Okay, end of that slide. So the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway has really deep roots in our community. It was started by the Woodstock Land Conservancy, the Woodstock, New York Transition, the Catskill Center, and the Woodstock Environmental Commission. We have also collaborated with the Woodstock Farm Festival, the Woodstock Jewish Congregation, and the Woodstock Library. We're also part of a larger organization that helped us get started in the first place, called Pollinator Pathway Northeast, which is an umbrella organization that includes pollinator pathways in towns throughout the Northeast, like in Connecticut and Maine and Massachusetts and Vermont, and so forth. Okay, now we're going to transition to another very important topic. In the video, you just saw Doug Tallamy mention neonicotinoid pesticides as something to avoid. These are also known as neonics. This evening, we're very pleased to have someone who can tell us about these pesticides and about a solution, which is the Birds and Bees Protection Act in Albany, which, if passed, can go a long way to remove these harmful chemicals from New York State. I'd like you to meet Lena Fausto, who is a contract organizer with the Natural Resources Defense Council, also known as NRDC. She focuses on outreach surrounding the Birds and Bees Protection Act. However, before she comes on, I want to mention an important local event that is related to what she will tell you. There'll be an in-person postcard writing get-together on Tuesday, March 7th at 2 p.m. called Postcards and Cookies. Sounds sweet. This event, which is open to all, will be happening at the Woodstock Jewish Congregation to support the Birds and Bees Protection Act. The address is 1682 Glasgow Turnpike in Woodstock. Thank you. And now, Lena Fausto.
Thank you, Georgia. Hi, everyone. My name is Lena Fausto. As mentioned, I work with the NRDC Action Fund on the Birds and Bees Protection Act. I'm just going to share my screen quick. Okay. And I'm here today to talk about, as mentioned, neonicotinoids or neonics, and why they're so bad for bees, birds, ecosystems, and our own health. So I'm going to touch on pollinators as well. I know Doug and Georgia did so, but they're very important. So NRDC's entrance into this work started with the honeybee, when in the mid-2000s, beekeepers started to see a dramatic decline in their hive populations across New York and the United States. And I'm sure folks on this call know, and we've already touched on, that bees are very important. 1 out of every 3 bites we eat come from pollination provided by bees and other pollinators. And to give you a sense of what that looks like, here's a grocery store produce section with the bees and pollinators we have now. And this is what it would look like without our bees and other pollinators. We would still, of course, have food, but we would be much more limited in our options and everything would be much more expensive. Beyond the grocery store, bees are integral to the survival of ecosystems. As Doug mentioned, I believe 80% of plants on the face of the earth require bees or other pollinators to reproduce. So as I mentioned, in the mid-2000s, beekeepers in New York and across the country saw the losses of their honeybee colonies suddenly start to skyrocket. Up until that point, they were losing maybe 10 to 15% due to winter cold, and those numbers became 40 to 50%, and not just in the winter, but also in the warm months too. So obviously something new was going on. And as we've touched on, honeybees are not native to New York. And unlike native species, they are bred as livestock. So even though we've seen this decline in numbers, they are continually being bred to be replaced, even if it takes more effort now. But this is not so with native species. This report from the New York Natural Heritage Program found that 40 to 60% are at risk of local extinction. And again, this is not just a problem for New York ecosystems, but also for food production. This comes from a study across the US, seeing that apples, blueberries, and cherries are pollinator limited nationwide. So this means that farmers would grow more of these crops if there were more bees, and in particular, wild bees. A similar study recently found that fruit production was down about 5% worldwide due to loss of pollinators. So why are we so worried about neonics specifically? There are definitely other things affecting pollinators, including climate change, habitat loss, parasites, pathogens. So why specifically neonics? Initially, it's probably helpful to know what neonics are. So neonics are neurotoxic insecticides, meaning that they are pesticides designed to kill bugs by attacking their nerves. So they attach to nerve cells and overstimulate them until they fail. But again, there are a lot of things that kill bees and other insects, so why neonics? There are 3 big reasons. So first of all, neonics are just really toxic, highly toxic to bees and other insects. Just 1 neonic treated corn seed has enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees. And neonics have actually made US agriculture 48 times more harmful to insect life since their introduction in the mid-2000s. And again, there are a lot of other things hurting bees, but none that track directly with the spike of losses we start to see in the mid-2000s, particularly with the uptick in the use of neonics on corn and soybean seed. So secondly, neonics are just really good at contaminating whole environments. So the way that they work is they're designed to permeate plants, to get into the roots, the leaves, the fruit, the pollen, and the nectar to effectively make the entire plant itself toxic to insects. So they can be applied in all different ways. They can be sprayed, but more commonly they're applied directly to soil, or even more commonly, as I mentioned, they're painted on the seeds themselves. And here is a picture of some neonic treated corn seed. So you can see it's painted on red directly to the seed. And so the idea of using these seeds is that as the plant is growing, it soaks the pesticide up into the plant, and the plant becomes the insecticide. The problem is that only about 2 to 5% actually make it up into the plant, while the other 94+% stay in the soil and in the environment. Some of it is released as toxic dust during planting, but the majority stays in the soil. And when it's in the soil, it can persist for years. It seems to be that neonics have a half-life of about 5 to 10 years. And the same properties that allow it to easily make its way up into the plant, namely its water solubility, also allow the neonic to move easily through the environment carried by rainwater to contaminate other soil. If there's plants in that soil, those plants will also become toxic, and then also into nearby water systems. So the third big problem is that they're just extremely popular. So they're the most popular, most used insecticide in the US. Virtually all conventional corn seed is pre-treated with a neonic before planting. So in New York, that's about 1 million acres of corn, plus about 1,000 acres of treated soybeans. But neonics are also used in non-agricultural spaces. So they're used in conventional landscaping, in conventional nurseries, on golf courses, and in lawns and gardens. And in these landscape uses, they are approved at much higher rates than in agriculture, sometimes 20 times higher. So we tend to see more toxic hotspots in suburban and urban areas, especially near golf courses. And studies show that neonic use has just continued to increase over the years. So since we have continued, we've seen them continue to increase the use of these chemicals, and because they persist in the environment for years, you then have a buildup of toxicity over time that continues to spread every time it rains, every time there's irrigation, contaminating new soil, new water, and new plant life. So we definitely see this in New York water. Neonics are the most commonly detected insecticide in the Long Island aquifer, and almost all the detections are above EPA's benchmark level for harms to aquatic ecosystems. And it's also important to note that conventional chlorination treatment generally fails to remove neonics. Only advanced filtration will do so. So this is important when we look at, especially New York City water, which is famously unfiltered. They just use chlorination. So that becomes a problem with contamination there. So I've given you a picture of what the contamination looks like. What effect is this having? So the first we've already touched on is that neonics are decimating our bee population, but we're seeing even more ecosystem-wide effects. Insect populations overall are being decimated, and this is also affecting soil health, the microbiome, with harm to pest predators and soil decomposers. And of course, this ripples up to other species, including birds, many of which rely on insects for food. We see the use of neonics related to mass losses of bird biodiversity. A Cornell Lab of Ornithology study came out a few years ago, and I believe Doug mentioned this as well, finding 30% bird losses in North America over the last 50 years. A couple of scientists came in after that study to look a little closer, and they found that the birds that don't rely on insects for their main source of food were actually doing pretty okay, while the birds that do rely on insects for their food were getting hammered and just declining rapidly. Another study out of Japan saw a similar thing when looking at fish species. So the introduction of neonics into an agricultural space near a fishery in Japan was associated with this fishery's collapse. The neonics were killing the water bugs or zooplankton that the fish relied on for food, and this caused the fish population to decline rapidly. And it's important to note that the levels of the neonics they found in the water there were levels that we see in New York water all the time. And these levels aren't even that dramatic. They're about parts per trillion, but that just shows you how toxic these neonics can really be. So neonics not only affect birds and fish indirectly, but they also have direct impacts on birds and other animals. For example, one neonic treated corn seed is enough to kill a small songbird, and even if it doesn't kill it, it can damage it neurologically, interfering with its ability to navigate or their ability to fly and find food. We also see them start to lose weight rapidly. So even if it doesn't kill it directly, it can lead to its decline. Mammals are also affected. Hunters in Minnesota were finding that the deer they were catching had some weird malformations going on, such as deformed jaws and decreased body and organ weight. So scientists had a suspicion that this was due to the introduction of neonics in the environment. So then a controlled study was done, and it found that the deer that were given water with neonics were more likely to give birth to fawns with these malformations or with a higher chance of mortality. But an interesting thing about this study too is that even the control group that were not given neonics in their water had neonics in their system when tested. So it just shows you how systematic these neonics are, that you can't even really do a controlled study. So from this study, they decided to test deer across the state. In 2019, it was found that 61% of deer had neonics in their bodies, with 29% above the levels that are associated with those birth defects and death. And then just 2 years later, in 2021, the test showed a jump, with virtually all deer in the state being found to have neonics in their bodies, with 64% at these concerning higher levels. And this was across the state, so not even really close by agricultural areas or urban areas, even by the boundary waters. So these are just all over the place. So of course, what's most worrisome about these studies is that deer are large mammals. Humans are also large mammals. So the CDC has found that half of all Americans are exposed to neonics on any given day. And in 2022, a study came out that was focused on 171 pregnant women from New York and 4 other states. And the study found that 94% of the women had neonics in their bodies, so more than half. And this study also showed a correlation to the deer study, in that over the 4-year period that the study was done, from 2017 to 2020, the levels of neonics in the pregnant women were increasing in frequency and in volume. And exposure to neonics are especially concerning when it comes to children and developing fetuses, with exposure in the womb associated with birth defects in the heart and brain and development of autism-like symptoms. And in adults, we see symptoms such as decreased sperm quantity and quality and other endocrine system related symptoms. And it should be noted too that these chemicals have been related to other neurologically damaging chemicals, right? So these toxins are meant to attack the nervous system, and we have the same nervous receptors in our brains that the insects do. So exactly like lead and mercury, we think that there is no safe level, especially when it comes to children or developing fetuses. So that brings me to what others have done. So if we're looking worldwide, in 2018, the EU banned essentially all outdoor uses of the 3 major neonics used there. France has banned outdoor use of all neonics. Canada imposed significant restrictions, and Quebec and Ontario have largely phased out of neonic treated field crop seeds. In I think 2015, there was 100% use, and now in 2021, it came out that there was 0.2% use of these crop seeds. In the US, the EPA hasn't done a great job historically of protecting us from the harms of pesticides. The latest decision that was made a few years ago by them allowed business with neonics to continue on as usual. The EPA is revisiting this decision in the spring. We're not holding our breath though, as history shows the EPA not doing a whole lot as far as pesticide regulation goes from a protection standpoint. So that leaves it to the states. New Jersey and Maine recently banned neonic use on non-agricultural landscapes. So those ornamental uses such as golf courses, gardens, lawns. Connecticut, Maryland, Vermont, and recently New York have all designated outdoor uses of neonics as restricted use pesticides, meaning that they can only be performed by a certified applicator. But this still means that landscapers can use them, pest control specialists. So New York, with the Birds and Bees Protection Act, would be the first state to include the seeds in the ban. So that brings us to the Birds and Bees Protection Act. So the act is based on a report from Cornell University that looks at over 1,100 peer-reviewed studies, basically everything that has looked at neonics and pollinators up to that date. And they found through doing this and through doing a cost-benefit analysis and looking at neonics versus their likely alternatives, were neonics to disappear? Because one of the main questions we like to ask when it comes to pesticides is, are the pesticides bad? And what would whatever replace them be worse? So there were 2 things that they found. First, the neonic corn, soy, and wheat seeds, while posing a big risk to pollinators, provided no overall net income benefit to farmers. So basically, the largest use of these insecticides in New York State are not providing an economic benefit for those who use them. And to break that down even more, very, very rarely would you see a yield benefit. And if you did, it was never enough to offset the cost of having the neonic put on the seed. Similarly, when looking at turf and ornamental uses, the study found that in 80+% of cases, neonics were being applied prophylactically. So basically like taking an antibiotic just in case you might get sick in the future, treating problems that don't yet exist. And even in cases where you might want to use an insecticide, there were a number of safer and more effective alternatives. So the Birds and Bees Protection Act just looks at those two uses, which actually account for 80 to 90% of the neonics going into New York's environments. The bill does have some exceptions. It's very narrowed in on those two uses. So for example, if a farmer did want to plant a non-treated corn seed, but still wanted to apply a neonic by spraying or to the soil, they could do so. But looking at other places that have put similar bans into place, such as Quebec, we know they won't do that because it doesn't provide any benefit and it just costs more to use the pesticide. And the reason the seeds are used so widely is because most conventional corn and soybean seed is just made with the neonics on them, and farmers have to buy them that way. But we've seen the market shift in other places when similar bans have been put into place. There are also a couple of exceptions when it comes to invasive species. So for some of those like hemlock woolly adelga or spotted lanternfly, there are exceptions when it comes to protecting against those. So what happened in the past with the bill? Last session, it did pass in the Assembly with a supermajority vote, but unfortunately it didn't get to the Senate floor. The year before, it passed in the Senate, but not the Assembly. So we're pretty hopeful that we'll pass it in both houses this year. We have a lot of support, a lot of momentum. It has a history with its third year going, so we're pretty hopeful. And that brings me to my last slide, which is how folks can get involved. So we do have lobby days. We had our first in-person lobby day actually today, and we had overall positive responses. We're hopefully having another one in the spring, and maybe a virtual one at some point, but most likely an in-person lobby day in Albany in the spring. And we love to have folks join us for those. It's pretty fun. You get to run around the Capitol and visit different offices. Signing on to our coalition letters. So we have a letter for farms, businesses, and organizations to sign on to in support. We also have a letter for breweries to sign on in support. And then we also have a petition for individuals to sign on to. And I can share all those materials as well. And then contacting your legislatures, hard to underestimate how much this matters. Calls are always the best. And really legislators love to hear from their constituents. So it's very impactful for you to call in support of this. Letter writing and emails are also wonderful. And then writing an op-ed or letter to the editor to your local paper, just to get the news out, to get your local officials to see it. Other opportunities, encouraging local leaders, groups to get involved, social media support, and more. And we can share all those via email as well. And I think that brings me to the end of my presentation, and we can move on to the Q&A.
Thank you, Lena. This was wonderful. And thank you, Georgia, also. Okay, let me start my video. Oh. Am I there? Yes, there I am. Thank you, Lena, and thank you, Georgia. This was a lot of information, very important information. And I just want to say that we will follow up this session with an email to everyone with all of the documents that Lena just mentioned for us to take action. So you will have those in an email soon. I think we can stay for now on the look at your questions and remain on the topic of the neonics since we're at it now. And important questions such as, can neonics that were used in the soil before maintain and contaminate new plants that are planted in that same soil?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, as I mentioned, neonics have a half-life of, we think about 5 to 10 years. But the good news with neonics is that they do eventually break down. There is some question on what the neonics break down into, if those chemicals will break down, but there's not a lot of science on that yet. A new study did come out recently that relates the possibility that they're finding PFAS in neonics, which we know is not good. That's a forever chemical. But right now, we think neonics do break down. So in 5 to 10 years, hopefully that soil will no longer have those neonics in them.
Thank you. Who controls the supply of seeds that is treated, and do farmers have options for non-treated seeds?
Yeah, so pretty much for soy and bean and wheat seeds, there is untreated seed available. For corn, it gets a little trickier because of the monopoly of the seed and chemical corporations. So right now, the people that make the seeds are also the people that make the chemicals. So because of that, it can be difficult to find conventional corn seed that is not treated. But what we know is that anytime that restrictions have been put on seed treatments, the market has opened up. And New York has a $100 million corn market. So it would be silly if any of the companies left that market behind. So like I said, in Quebec, it took about a couple of years to really turn the market all around, and there was then corn seed that was provided that was non-neonic treated.
Mm-hmm. So going back with perhaps neonics remaining in the soil, you mentioned neonics affects the microbiome in the soil potentially. Can neonics affect our own microbiome?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it definitely affects humans. I don't know. I don't believe neonics stick around in humans like it does stick around in soil. But yeah, I don't know the question. I don't think there has been or I don't know the answer necessarily, because I don't think there's been enough science yet done on effects on humans. It's only been in the past couple of years that they've looked at effects on humans. So I guess we'll have to just, look for new science. I can definitely see if there's anything that talks about that and get back to y'all. But yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure.
Yes, and in the same vein, can they affect our immunity and perhaps increase the probability of another pandemic? Is a question.
Yeah, I think definitely there's just not enough science yet. But it'll be interesting to see the effects. I mean, I don't know enough about probably like lead and mercury, what we've related these chemicals to, if those have effects on immunity. I mean, they definitely weaken just people's bodies. So I assume that would have effects on immunity, but I don't know enough about the science behind that, and if there is enough science really yet.
Thank you. Maybe thinking about our own landscapes surrounding our homes and properties, and thinking of Doug Tallamy's presentation, a related question. Will I have to get rid of my ornamental plants that are not native and that are from Asia or Europe if I want to help pollinators? That would be a question for Georgia.
Yeah, no, you don't have to do that because unless the plants are invasives, like for example, barberry is one that you would probably want to get rid of, which also helps deer ticks, barberry does, or ornamental bittersweet or something like that. But you can try to just plant more natives or allow them to grow. A lot of them already are growing here, like a lot of like goldenrod and certain asters and things like that. So if you stop mowing your lawn so much, you might see some of those come up. But some people confuse non-native plants with invasive plants. Not all non-natives are invasives, just certain ones of them. Like I mentioned, barberry multiflora rose, Japanese stilt grass, etc. There are lists of those. So I hope that sort of answers the question. But add some natives to what you already have already. Maybe take out some of your non-natives.
Mm-hmm. And somebody mentions that in Woodstock there is, and not only just in Woodstock, by the way, is an infestation, big infestation of invasive barberry bush, and that we should keep an eye out for it, but very hard to remove, from what I understand.
Yes, well, there are people who know how to do that, and we actually have somebody on our committee from the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Project, and they know how to do that kind of thing. I shouldn't mention what I've been told about how there are ways to remove it that are not so difficult.
Oh, really? That's good. So if a person does not live in Woodstock, can they become a member of the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway?
Well, yes, they can, but it's always better, if they find maybe there's a pollinator pathway in their town. What they could do is they can go to the Pollinator Pathway Northeast website and look to see if maybe there's a pollinator pathway in their town, which is better. Have local, and if not, well, maybe they could try to start one in their town. That's also a possibility.
Where's that question? What is the best place to find out about the best native plants for our location and specific local conditions?
Yeah, okay, so go to the National Wildlife Federation website, and they have a native plant finder. And there they have a wonderful, what you have to do is you have to sign up, and then you have to put in your I think your zip code, and then they'll show you the lists of native plants and which ones are most beneficial. Like they'll show you, for example, around here, certain oak trees will support 400 different species of caterpillar, and that's considered to be a very productive native plant. And then they'll down the line show you, cherry trees are very good, and on and on. And you can find plants that are good and plants also that grow in your particular situation, the right sun and soil and water conditions. So that's a wonderful source. Well, you can go to Catskill Native Nursery. They can help you out there. Also, you can go to Prairie Moon Nursery, and they have a wonderful website with different native plants, and they show you where their range is and what the conditions are and so forth. You don't need to buy from them necessarily, but you can do a lot of research there. So that's what I'd suggest.
Yes, and somebody mentions we do have a few nurseries, and you just mentioned them, Catskill Nursery and others. An important comment from someone that of something that we can do also to maintain life of our pollinators is by keeping lights off at night, or by installing a motion detector light or a yellow light. That is also something that Doug Tallamy recommends, because insects and moths get exhausted by the light at night, where they should be spreading their energy, mating and reproducing. So that is enormously disruptive to their life, and that's such a simple thing we can do. Thank you for that comment. Does Doug Tallamy feel that the DEC guidelines for woodlot management are optimal? I don't know if anybody can answer that question. It's a difficult one. We should ask him directly, I guess, when we have him. So we talked about the supply of seed and where we can actually find, in the same way that we can search for local plants in those local native nurseries. I don't know how easy it is to find seeds that are also untreated and safe to plant.
Well-
Yeah, so, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Lena.
I was just going to say, for neonic treated seed, most of that seed is conventional corn, soybean, wheat seed. So it's not going to be really people just planting at their homes. It's going to be, you know, large farms, conventional farms. And there are, when you go to a conventional nursery, you will find plants that have most likely been treated with neonics. So as suggested, definitely go to native nurseries to find plants that are not treated with neonics. You know, if you have a landscaper, ask your landscaper what they're using, because anything that's it's hard to tell necessarily what chemicals have neonics in them, because you need to know the chemical names. They're not just going to say neonics on them. So some of the chemical names, for example, you have imidacloprid, clothianidin. I'm bad at pronouncing these too, but they're longer chemical names, and you can look them up online what neonic chemicals are. So if you ever go to buy a pesticide from a garden store, you're going to want to look and see if any of those chemicals are on them. Anything that's like a 2-in-1, so if it's something to like feed your roses and also kill bugs, it most likely has a neonic in it. But it can be tough to know because you do need to know the chemical names.
Thank you, Lena. Somebody did ask this question about, you know, pesticide being clearly labeled as neonics or not. So that's important to know that they're not. How can I keep mice and ants out of my house without using a pest control service? Pestmaster thinks their products are benign, but I'm not convinced, somebody says.
That's a good question. I don't necessarily know the answer to that. Most of the pesticides we're talking about are used on plants. But, you know, I'm sure that I don't know if they would be neonics if they're using them in your house, but it's quite possible that they are. So you might want to ask whoever's servicing that. But yeah, I can always look a little bit more into that too and send along an answer later on.
Yeah, well, what a lot of people do is you don't have to use a bunch of chemicals. You can use mouse traps for one, and for ants, I know you can get this stuff called taro, which I think it's just it's something that's really not toxic, and you just put it out on these little buttons around your house, and the ants come to it, and it looks like a feedlot with the ants, you know, just drinking this up, and then they bring it back to their nest, and they disappear. I mean, you won't get rid of them totally, but you'll really knock the population down, and you won't see them. And the same thing with mice. You can't, you generally don't get rid of them totally, but if you keep at it, you keep the population really low. And that, I think a lot of people do things this way.
Thank you. I had missed that comment that says the catalog will indicate their plants are neonic free, and if they don't list it, it probably does. And also look for holes in some of the leaves that indicates they may not be sprayed. Mm-hmm. So I want to mention, I want to recall, somebody also says that the Hudson Valley Seed Company sells one New York native pollinator seed mix. Mm-hmm. I think I planted this one actually, and it's really good and beautiful. We are getting close to the end of a list of questions. I don't know if everybody feels their answer was answered. I want to take a minute to mention again that we have that our postcard party coming up. You can sign up for it on the Woodstock Jewish Congregation website and on the Woodstock Land Conservancy and Pollinator Pathway websites, all of our sponsors. You can sign up there. Georgia, can people go without signing up? Will they have to sign up?
Oh, I don't know.
We don't know. Yeah.
We don't know.
Sorry.
Yeah, we could find that out.
Yeah.
Is Gail out there?
It's always better to sign up.
Yeah. Let me.
I don't know if people have any more questions or any more comments from our speakers. Elena, anything you would like to add?
One thing that I didn't mention in the presentation, but I always like to mention as well is this bill addresses the environmental justice issues that are caused by pesticide neonics, specifically. As mentioned, you can use certain types of certain types of filtration to get rid of neonics, but that type of filtration is very expensive. And also you can try to avoid neonics by eating organically, but that is also expensive. So the folks that are already food insecure are just going to be made more food insecure by the fact that we're losing pollinators. This is reducing food production. Food is going to get more expensive. And then the folks that can't afford this more expensive filtration are going to be more detrimentally affected by neonics as well. So I just like to mention that that part of this conversation as well.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
And I see some comments of people feeling really sad about all this. It is terrifying and very sad indeed, but
it is scary, but we're really, we're feeling pretty confident about getting this bill passed this year. And, we can, it's good that people feel things and then they can help out. And, this would be a pretty groundbreaking bill for the United States because it's the first bill that focuses on these agricultural uses. So we really, we're hopeful.
Yes, and the relief is in the action. So I think that's also something that people can do for themselves. Well,
so can I mention something? Yeah, Lena, you will tell us who to contact, not just our local, our representatives to the state, our state senator and assembly person, but there are other people who are key to getting this bill passed, right? And you'll give us the names of those people and tell us how to.
Yeah, definitely. I can send along a list. It is definitely, most of the time, legislators will focus in on their constituents, but it is good to follow up with other folks, and also the governor's office is, of course, is going to be important, especially, when we pass this bill in June, it'll be, the rest of the year will be focusing on getting the governor to sign on as well. So yeah, I can definitely send along a list of folks that it's important to reach out to.
Great.
Thank you. We're very grateful.
Thank you. That's great.
Well, thank you everyone for participating in this evening's event. Well, it was really great audience. Thank you. We have two more events coming up in our film series happening on the last Monday of March in April. So mark your calendar for our next movie on the 27th of March. It will be a great one. We'll be showing the movie Inhabitants. And we're very excited to have the filmmaker, Costa Boutikaris, join us. And this event will be in person. So we hope you'll join us there. So make sure to stay tuned to our announcements and keep an eye out for a follow-up email from the Woodstock Land Conservancy. This email will be containing a recording of tonight's event, some resources from the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway, and Lena's documents, including a sample script for calling your representative. And also make sure to mark your calendar for the exciting in-person postcard writing event, again, scheduled on Tuesday, March 7 at 2 p.m. Cookies and postcards, and I bet you there's going to be coffee and tea also probably. And again, this event is open to all, and it will be happening at the Woodstock Jewish Congregation. And it's to support the Birds and Bees Protection Act. We're very grateful for our presenters and guests, Doug Tallamy's tireless advocacy for the smallest creatures of our visible world, for the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway, and Georgia for their energizing impact on the local community of people and pollinators, and the NRDC for the crucial work that you are doing to push forward powerful legislation on nature's behalf. Thank you so much, Lena, for joining us tonight and for empowering us with actionable tools and for answering our questions. And of course, thank you to the co-organizers of this event, Georgia, Kirk, Gail, Ellie, Caroline, Polly, Karine, and Liz. You all have a wonderful month of March, and let's meet again soon in our next event, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you.